Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight for this memo masterclass. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm on, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and I'd like to extend that respect to the traditional owners of the land from where you're all joining this call today. I'd specifically like to acknowledge all queer, trans, gender diverse, brother boys, sister girls, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have existed on continents of so-called Australia since centuries before we are joining here today. My name is Lauren. I am a queer parent alongside my partner Lucy to our gorgeous daughter Mila, who's 19 months old. And we're joined this evening by Sarah Jefford. Sarah is a family creation and surrogacy lawyer. She's also a mum, an IVF mum. She's been an egg donor and a surrogate to a two-dad family. So it's safe to say that her both professional and personal experience in this field is, to such a wealth of knowledge. So we're really fortunate to have her join us this evening. The format of tonight's masterclass is a bit of an interview between myself and Sarah, but we will open up the chat will be open the whole time, and we'll open up the floor kind of for the last 15 minutes of tonight's call. So you have the opportunity to submit your own questions that are unique to your circumstances for either Sarah or myself to provide some responses or feedback. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sarah. And Sarah, maybe if you'd like to introduce yourself a little bit further about your work and some of the clients that you work with in your practice.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lauren. So yeah, my name is Sarah Jefford. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm also coming into from Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country. So I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and everybody in the chat, wherever you're coming from. I am a family creation lawyer, as you said. My firstborn child was an IVF baby, and he's now 13. And then number two boy was actually a bit of a surprise. He was a couch baby. We didn't have to go back to IVF for him, but we were treated for male factor infertility. So it kind of led me down the path of thinking, well, I'm fertile. Maybe I could do something to help people. And that led me down the path of being an egg donor. And then I became a surrogate, and I delivered a baby girl about 5.5 years ago for two dads here in Melbourne. And alongside that, I used to be a divorce lawyer. Now I'm like a recovering divorce lawyer. So I switched focus away from the separation family law, and now I'm at the beginning with the creation family lawyer. So yeah, that's all I do now is surrogacy and donor conception. So most of my clients are entering surrogacy arrangements here in Australia. Some of my clients go overseas to do surrogacy, and also assist with donor arrangements, particularly for sperm donor arrangements, but all sorts of like co-parenting, poly families, all the different rainbow ways of making a family. That's essentially what I do. Yeah.
Well, we certainly need people like you in our corner, because there are so many ways to create a family, and often having that written formal agreement can be incredibly beneficial for unique families. I'd like to acknowledge that we're hosting tonight's call first and foremost to information share for the queer community, same-sex parents, solo by choice parents, and we hope that you guys leave this call feeling seen, heard, validated. I know when Lucy and I embarked on this journey, we were dying for resources like this. We really were in lockdown. I was just speaking with Sarah, and I was like Googling, like, how on earth are we going to create this family that we're dreaming of? So this call is for you guys. I would also like to welcome any friends, family, allies, extended community, healthcare practitioners that are wanting to show up, learn a little bit more, educate yourselves so that you can support families like ours, or support your friends, families, whoever it is in our community that is on this path to conception, because often it comes with a lot more consideration, financial, emotional, logistical. We'll get into a lot of that in tonight's call, I'm sure. But thank you, regardless of where you fall on that spectrum. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to perhaps start at the very beginning. Sarah, as I touched on earlier, for Lucy and I, it was a really overwhelming process on where on earth to begin. I suppose there are so many ways that same-sex people, relationships, solo, however, can start a family. Where do you suggest beginning with
Yeah, that's a good question, because I guess in some ways we have the law. We always, start with the law because I'm a lawyer. But what I tell my clients quite often is that our laws around children and families don't really catch up with all the different ways that we create our families. We're always kind of playing catch up. The laws are always changing, but I wonder whether they'll ever sort of catch up for all the different ways that we have family. So as I mentioned, a lot of my clients are looking at co-parenting or donor arrangements or even poly relationships. I guess the question for anybody that's thinking about making a baby, whether it's on your own or with a partner or even with somebody else's, other arrangements, is what does your family look like? And what does that story look like for the children involved? And whether it might be, seeking out a donor, for example, or finding a surrogate, what do these relationships look like, not just for us and our child, but also for the child and these extended people in their network? And hopefully, I guess, creating a story that is positive that you can share with them and that they can carry with them throughout life. I guess that's one of the wonders of being able to do this, is that in my old life as a divorce lawyer, I was often working with people that hadn't really had that opportunity to sit down and say, what does our family look like? That they would be dealing with the outcomes at the end if they hadn't really thought about it, or the people that they were, now kind of connected to for life. And I do think about that, for example, me as an egg donor or me as a surrogate, that no matter what happens from here, I am connected with these children for life, for their lives and my life. What does that look like in the future? Because we can't predict everything, but we can kind of start it from a place of love and start it from a place of being open and honest about that, because this isn't just my story, it's also their story. And we're talking about hypothetical children, but starting it from that place of what does this story look like for them? That, like you say, it can be very overwhelming when you might be needing a donor or a surrogate or looking at other different options. But where hetero couples might not really think about it, you have an opportunity to really think it through and do what's right for your particular circumstances. Yeah.
Absolutely. Something that really led the charge for us was exploring every possible option to us. Now, obviously, we're a two-mum family. I had the urge to carry, Lucy not so much. So that was, we'd tick that off. But so our missing piece of the puzzle, if you will, was trying to find a donor. How might someone go about deciding on who might be the right donor for them, whether that's a known donor, an unknown donor? I know something that worked really well in our relationship was exploring every possible avenue so that we could kind of have conversations with one another about what made us kind of tense up or what didn't sit well with us. So then we could kind of discern where our boundaries might lie, the relationship that our future child, or now Mila, would have with the donor, or the absence of it, if that is something that aligns with other parents wanting to go about this journey. What's your advice on people kind of seeking out that donor relationship? Because I know there are so many avenues that people can seek out that piece of their puzzle for their family, whether it be through clinics, through apps now, friends.
Even
what's
Facebook
your advice?
Yeah. And I guess in some ways, you're doing all of that research. I think it's a great idea to look at all of the different options. Do we want a donor that is a close friend or family member? I have lots of arrangements where it will be one woman carrying, but it will be the other woman's brother who is the donor. And they like the idea that they do have that genetic connection. But then there'll be others that are like, we really don't want that sort of close relationship with the donor. So it can be this kind of whole spectrum, a very close relationship like an uncle. I often use that analogy that this person might be like an uncle figure. But also it might be the further distant relationship where you might know the donor but not have ongoing, day-to-day contact, or a clinic recruited donor where you don't know much about them at all. And there's no right or wrong, because all of those different versions are how we make children and how we make babies. That's fine. I guess it's about thinking about what relationship do we want with our donor and what relationship do we want our child to have with them, if anything. I think a few rules that I talk to people about is, number one, there's really no such thing as anonymous donation anymore, because even a clinic recruited donor, there is now access to information for the child when they turn 18. But also things like ancestry.com took away all the mystery for us. So there will be ways that even if you used a clinic recruited donor or somebody that you don't know, there will be ways for the child to connect with their donor in the future. or for other donor-conceived siblings to make connection. And that's fine. I guess it's really about just accepting that that's a fact. And then what story are we sharing with them about that? What we hear from donor-conceived people is that the history of donor conception isn't always positive. There was a lot of secrecy. There'll be stories about, for example, medical students being recruited to be donors, but being told, don't worry, you'll never hear from the kids. And then the kids become real people and actually have an opinion about that, and they want to connect with their donor, or they want access to, medical history. So what we hear from these donor-conceived people is, please tell me that I was donor-conceived, and please allow me to have access to information about my donor. And that doesn't necessarily mean so that I can go around there and be his best mate, so that I can have, regular contact, because that will be different for some people. But it's more about having access to information about that so that I can make choices about, what information do I want? What can I tell my doctor about my health history? Those sorts of things. So I guess accepting that it's not anonymous and sharing that story with the child, whatever that looks like, is, I guess, the decisions you need to make, knowing that clinic recruited or anonymous, it's still got that element of knowledge in the future. And then also I talk to lots of people about, if they have a relationship with their donor, it might be a close friend or family member, having really big discussions with them and being able to say, maybe this person's not right for us. There's something about this relationship that says we really love them as a friend. Maybe we don't want them as our donor, and that's okay too. Some of the best ones that work are the ones that say, well, he's going to be a special uncle, but he doesn't live around the corner, so we're not going to have to see him every day. We can have that kind of distant relationship if we need to, have some clear boundaries. I also use the analogy of if he was my brother, for example, I didn't conceive with any sperm from him, but if I wanted my kids to have a close relationship with their uncle, I can do that. But ultimately, I have the parental responsibility to make decisions about their relationships with him and with extended family. And it's the same for a donor relationship, whether you're really close or not. It still comes back to the parent, and that really is the person that gave birth and their partner making the core decisions about parenting and what those relationships look like with other people. Yeah.
I suppose that's where communication becomes, the glue that holds this all together, because as we touched on, we've met previously, is these relationships, especially as these children grow and as we as parents experience life with a donor conceived child, it's an evolution. And while something can be a decision we make at one point in our lives, we don't know how these children are going to grow up. We don't know how we as their parents are going to feel, as time goes on. So I suppose that's where employing the support of professionals such as yourself, or seeking out, to conceive in a clinic if that's where you feel more comfortable, so that you have, I suppose, boundaries and structure and the law on your side, because there have been lots of donor stories, especially in the media, where things have gone incredibly wrong. So that's where I suppose seeking out that support early on is incredibly important, just to protect your family structure, so everyone is on the same page. Even if your donor or your intended donor is a brother or a best friend, those relationships can change. Not every relationship is set in stone for the rest of eternity, especially as things happen. So yeah, great
I think
point.
also, and this sometimes does happen, where, for example, you might have a same-sex female couple that have a friend that's a donor, and this is the only opportunity in his life that there will be a child from him. And he says, yes, I'll be your donor. That's a great idea. And then the baby arrives and something shifts and he goes, oh, wow, this is really good. I'm going to be really involved. And we haven't been clear about what those expectations and boundaries and relationships are. And I know for me, I've been an egg donor. And the first day that I met one of the babies born from my eggs, I was like, what is this going to be like? This is like, what if I have all this rush of emotion about seeing this child that looks like me? And actually it was fine. I really was very excited that they had a baby, was not excited for this child being any way connected to me. He looked a bit like me, I guess. But everybody, I guess you don't really know how you're going to feel until you experience it. And like you say, being really clear and communicating with whoever the donor might be or anybody in that relationship. I also talk to people about what the extended family might think about that. So if the donor's mum, for example, might have an opinion about her new grandchild that's coming into the world, having some clear boundaries about, oh, actually, what are those relationships? And you don't have to have it set in concrete, but you do want to be very clear about who the parents are and who's making the decisions. I guess it's also that, like you touched on before, clinic recruited or a clinic conception as opposed to home inseminations. People often ask me, well, what's the difference? In many ways, the law doesn't differentiate. I guess if you go through a clinic, you know that the intended parents will arrive at the clinic and they'll be referred to as the intended parents, and the donor will be referred to as the donor, and they will be signing documents that indicates that they are donating sperm or donating eggs, and the intended parents are the ones that are intending to be parenting that child, that future child. And they do the counselling with the clinic counsellors, and they have checklists, and they sign all these documents. And then the donor leaves after they've done their part, and the pregnant person goes off and does the pregnancy. In home inseminations, we don't have that kind of shop front where we get to arrive as a donor. And as much as people might say, oh no, it was very clear that that person was the donor and I'm the parent, the only two people that really know that are the people involved. So I'm not suggesting don't do home inseminations. If that's right for you, go for it. I've done home inseminations. We could talk all night about how awkward that is. But having legal advice, thinking about having a written agreement, thinking about, are we really clear here about the relationship? Because the home inseminations actually kind of crosses an intimacy boundary in some ways. And we need to be really clear on what our expectations are when we come out of it the other side and there's a human being that we're dealing with. Yeah.
You've just answered my next question, which kind of is what's involved in, once we've found our donor, how do we go about the conception process? You touched on home insemination. Obviously, there's the clinic setting. In the clinic, you can also choose to opt for a known donor. So if home insemination, as Sarah mentioned, isn't comfortable for you, you and your known donor can go to the clinic and say, this is what we want to do. You all sit through counselling, which, for us, when we went through that process, it was mandated counselling at the time. And we were sort of like, hang on a second, we're a queer couple wanting, it's like you're making us sit through therapy so we can be parents. It just felt a bit like jarring, but it ended up being an incredibly clarifying process for us, because our therapist was a real advocate for us, and she had such an incredible breadth of knowledge of this space, and like you, Sarah, is able to direct people to resources whereby they can sort of think about these hypothetical children. And at the end of the day, children like Mira, or children who are born of same-sex or solo parent arrangements, they're going to want to know how they came to be. And so that very much informed our decision-making process and what we felt comfortable as her parents saying, mummy and mummy went to a doctor and we asked for their help to have you. And, with the generosity of your donor, we were able to do that. And so I think kind of playing out that future conversation and how that aligned for us, whether we could tell that with a proud chest as opposed to feeling any shame or embarrassment about it. That's certainly not what we wanted, because children really pick up on that.
Absolutely.
And it's so important for those children, especially donor conceived children, to feel so empowered by their parents' choices, because they are going to be growing up with a really unique story. So if she or any donor conceived child can see their mums or their dads go, oh wow, they're so proud of me and my story is so unique and they're able to tell it to me and I'm excited, that was so important to us. So I really strongly recommend anyone who's kind of thinking about this process coming to, there are pros and cons, I suppose. I'm hesitant to call them that though, because there's no wrong way. Home insemination is a hell of a lot cheaper than going to a clinic. So,
but it's also really awkward. And I do say, I guess thinking about those different ways that it can be done. One of the quotes that I've heard from a counsellor from VARTA, who's one of the Victorian resources that we can talk about, was that we want to share that story with love, that you're right, mummy and mummy went to the clinic and we had the generosity of a donor and we made you. Isn't that a lovely story? Because kids will pick up on there being any sort of secrecy or shame about this. And I say that to all parents that I talk to, or future parents, that if there's a question of whose eggs and sperm are going to be used, be open about that. You don't have to go around and tell everybody at the shops, but making sure that that information is not a secret. There's no shame about it. I know for some same-sex families, there's that question mark of, well, if you're the one that gave the egg or the sperm and I gave no genetics, is there a question about who's the real parent or who's the real mum or who's the real dad? And that's really hard. So I don't know that I've got an answer for that, because you'll get that question at Bunnings. My husband even got questions like that. You know, people ask stupid things, they say stupid things, they want to comment on whether the child looks like a particular parent, all of that sort of stuff. But if you own that story with love for your family unit, then that's what the child will pick up on, that's the story of love that they were created. But also in terms of those different options of home insems or clinic or whatever, there's obviously different options at the clinic. One of the things, the benefits of clinic, is that they can do things like sperm analysis. They can check your AMH level to check your egg reserves. They can also do STI checks, which are really important. We haven't touched on this, but some people will find a donor through Facebook groups. And then there'll be a little bit of seedy stuff going on where the donor might say, oh, let's just do natural insemination, which they're referring to having sex. I do not advise for that one. I think you need to get legal advice before that. But also make sure you are safe going through this. And if you're talking to a donor and going outside of the clinic, then talking about health checks and STI checks. You can also do genetic testing if you want. You don't have to go to an IVF clinic for that. So you can be checking for whether the person providing the egg and the person providing sperm are like genetic matches on carrying certain things. And also having conversations around safety. And if you're getting somebody from Facebook to drop by with some sperm, actually knowing who this person is. And I've seen people say, well, I just know their first name. And it's like, well, it's not just about the story for the child. We need to know that you're also safe in that process. And the clinic offers that. But if home inseminations is your preference, then just putting in some boundaries around what those relationships look like. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We've touched quite a bit on, I suppose, using sperm donors. What would be the kind of process for a two-dad family seeking out a surrogate, or, you know, a solo parent that needs a surrogate? I suppose in, you know, lesbian relationships, there's two wombs, and getting sperm is, you know, inarguably a lot easier than getting a womb to carry a pregnancy to term. So there's, you know, while queer families, you know, experience lots of roadblocks and barriers, I really need to acknowledge the privilege that lots of two mum families have in that, because it's a whole other ball game.
And I guess if we
families.
talk, the story we talked to my kids about when they were younger is a book about what makes a baby, and there's sperm and there's eggs and there's uterus. And for a lot of women or cis women, they've already got two of those things, and finding the sperm is a lot easier. And to be honest, being a sperm donor, I reckon, might be a little bit more fun than being an egg donor, because of the process that's involved. But also for that means that for two dad families, they've got to find an egg donor and they have to find a surrogate. So that's the hardest part. Generally, what happens when clients come to me for their surrogacy arrangement is that they've found an egg donor, and that process can kind of happen alongside or before or after the surrogacy stuff. Essentially, what we have is that they would go to an IVF clinic and they would do an egg retrieval IVF cycle to inseminate eggs with sperm from one or both of the dads. And they put them in the storage, and then they do all the counselling involved that you would normally do for a donor arrangement. And then separately to that, they're also potentially doing surrogacy counselling. So counselling with a counsellor from the same clinic, usually the same counsellor, but this time it's with the surrogate and her partner. Donations, counselling and legal advice is fairly straightforward. Surrogacy has extra complexity because it's a bit of an odd one. Our law presumes that when somebody gives birth, they are the legal parent. So that applies in your case, for example, whoever gives birth, you're the legal parent, and your partner is also presumed to be a legal parent. You don't have to do a legal process after the birth. You're both the legal parents and you're on the birth certificate. For surrogacy, that's also the case, which means the surrogate gives birth and she's the legal parent, and her partner is also the legal parent. Even though that wasn't her intention when she gave birth, she doesn't want to parent that child. She's actually the legal parent at birth. So then the intended parents, in this case, two dads, need to apply to the court for a parentage order, which is a bit like an adoption order. And they're essentially asking for a transfer of parentage from the birth parents, the surrogate and a partner, over to the intended parents, and then they get a new birth certificate. So there's a lot of processes before they go through the surrogacy with counselling and legal advice and signing agreements and all of that sort of stuff. And they've got to have embryos created somewhere in there too. And then after the birth, they go through a whole other legal process to actually be recognised as the child's parents. So yes, there's some privilege in having a uterus and eggs and not needing a surrogate, because of those processes involved in finding all the bits. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That leads me to my next question in terms of, for all of these different arrangements, I mean, we kind of touched on this earlier, cost factors into a lot of decision making. IVF, unless you're a two-dad family, needing to go through IVF by way of, getting your egg donor's eggs, and that is part of that process to surrogacy. However, for us, IVF certainly wasn't the first option. We were trying for IUI, which is intrauterine insemination.
Which is
we
a bit
had
like
a few
turkey baster, but at the clinic. So it's, got a higher chance of success, I think. Yeah.
Totally. But we had a few failed rounds of that. And, like any kind of bright-eyed, like, queer couple that rocked up to the clinic, we were so excited. And while they tell you not to get your hopes up entirely, we're like, sure, this is going to work. Like, we're not, we're touching on this earlier, I'm not infertile, like, this is going to be great. We're going to have a baby. And it took multiple rounds, and it was such an incredibly emotional process. How can people going through this process, I suppose, mentally, financially, and kind of physically prepare themselves for what might lie ahead, and kind of to plan, prepare, and budget for that approach, whether they're going through, a home insemination is obviously a lot more costly, but you also might not need to seek out someone like yourself, like a lawyer, to help with those legal arrangements. What are some of the costs involved in those different avenues?
So for all the donor, and again, I guess I see people that have opted in to get legal advice. So I don't talk to the people that didn't get legal advice generally, thankfully, because they're often the ones that, are more likely not to go so well. I would say certainly getting some legal advice is a good idea. And most lawyers like myself will do like a half-hour consult, and that may be all you need. You don't necessarily need a 25-page contract between you that's, $5,000 worth of drafting, because it's not necessary. But also counselling is really important. And if you're going through a clinic, they provide all of that counselling through the clinic. But if you're not going through a clinic, it's a good idea to access fertility counselling with a private counsellor, because they will talk to you about all those things. What are the expectations between the donor and the parents? What are the expectations between the parents? I guess it's an opportunity, again, that a lot of cis hetero couples don't take, is talking about this stuff before we go ahead to talk through issues about parenting and expectations and values and all of that. So legal advice and counselling, and then of course the IVF costs would be the greatest cost. I would say that it's a good idea not to scrimp on these sorts of expenses, because you're, in some ways, for legal advice, I see it as a bit of an insurance policy. That if the intended parents get legal advice and their donor gets legal advice, then you're kind of securing everybody into this. This is our intention here. This is what we want. And we can talk through these issues so that there's less likely to be a problem later. And the counselling is similar, to talk through that stuff before it becomes a problem. I don't want to see you in 3 years when it's a problem. I'd much rather have that conversation before conception. And then, IVF costs would be the greatest. And I also see, I guess I see the full range of arrangements. Home inseminations are certainly cheaper. But you can still do it well by making sure you've done blood tests and you've had big conversations with. In fact, if you're not investing in IVF, maybe invest in more counselling and more legal advice to make sure it's really watertight as well, as much as it can be. Yeah.
Definitely. Something that really helped us was getting on the phone or emailing the clinic that we were going through, asking for their price lists, which sounds like such a funny concept, but these clinics have them. Their books are watertight, and they essentially have annual price lists. So you can see, if I've got to do another round of this fertility treatment, if I need to store these embryos, we're still paying for embryo storage. Like, there are costs that are involved, not just in that one cycle, but beyond. And for us, that was something that we were just like, whoa, like, it felt like everywhere we looked, there was just like another tab on that invoice or another kind of fee popping up. So
that is what I see, unfortunately, when people talk about IVF surrogacy costs. They often have that confusion about, why did the clinic just charge us another $5,500 for management fees? What does that even mean? What are they managing? And asking the question and shopping around for clinics. One of the other things that we have, I think it's there are some resources nationwide, but in Victoria, we have an annual report on all the IVF clinics. So you can see their stats on how many treatment cycles did they do, how many live births, and how many surrogacy arrangements they did, which is actually really important for surrogacy. And you can kind of then compare and find the right fit for you. What I found, though, I've been to a couple of IVF clinics as a donor and as a surrogate and doing IVF myself. It was often the bedside manner I found more important than necessarily what the price list looked like, but that's going to be different for everybody. If you find a clinician that's not particularly rainbow friendly, find another one. There are ones out there that are, you know, they don't just stick a rainbow flag on the door. They are actually invested in rainbow families, and you can ask the community for recommendations. Who should I see? This is, you know, 2-mum family, 2-dad family, and people will tell you what their experiences are. And I think that's really important.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm always very honest about the clinic that we went through, and we were referred there by our fertility specialist. So sometimes, you know, I went to our doctor, and Lucy and I sat down at our GP, who we love, and we're like, we want to have a family. And then, you know, we were referred. But often some fertility specialists are linked to a clinic. And so, yeah, I don't know if we would go through that same clinic, because we had a few really horrible heteronormative assumptions that made us feel pretty shitty. So while they had a rainbow flag on the footer of their website, it definitely wasn't carried out through their policy and practices. Yeah, and bedside manner, as you said, Sarah, really does matter, because, you know, you're incredibly emotional. You're already, it feels like, I know when we were going through this process to conceive Mila, it was like, okay, we've done that next step. It's like you're constantly reaching the next barrier, and then it just feels like that finish line keeps getting pushed out and further and further. So, you know, and coming back to pricing, even if you can get on the phone and, you know, gain clarity, please don't be afraid to do that, because I'd see numbers pop up on our bill and I'd just call them and be like, why is that there? Make it make sense to me, because that wasn't explained to me before. If you can get as much information as you possibly can, you're only going to be able to better advocate for yourself or your partner throughout this process. But so much of it is about learning kind of on the fly, because no one's an expert. No one wants to be an expert in this stuff.
And I say though too, unfortunately, I see also that clinicians and clinic staff they're not always the experts on these things. I donated eggs through a couple of clinics, and so the cycle would cost $10,000 or $15,000. I didn't pay for that, but I did get the Medicare rebate dumped in my account, which was like $8,000. So I'd wake up one morning and be like, oh, lottery win, I got $8,000, and then go, oh no, wait a minute, I think that might be somebody else's rebate. So asking the question and never feeling like it's a stupid question, it definitely is not. You're entitled, you're paying for a service. Yes, it's a health service, but you are paying for it, and you're entitled to clear answers on your questions, and asking questions like, why is that fee there and what does that represent? Challenging it if it doesn't actually apply in your particular circumstances. Why did you charge us for semen analysis when we did one with our GP? That sort of thing. Because don't assume that just because you're new to this that you should be taken for a ride, and it could be a mistake and it ends up taken off your invoice. You never know. Yeah,
absolutely. Such good advice. I suppose something that I wanted to touch on tonight as well is we've talked about it briefly, but considering this life that we're creating beyond conception, you know, that obviously influences the conception process, how we choose a donor or a surrogate. We've talked about, I suppose, telling a child their unique story of coming to be. You mentioned telling close friends and family. I think that's a really important part of this puzzle too, because while you certainly don't owe everyone your story, like, you know, while I'm such a sharer by nature, our donor story is something that we're keeping close to our family, because for us, until Mila knows that story, it's her story, especially having, you know, a bit of a social media following, or, you know, a public presence, if you will. If other people know her story before her, that to me isn't always necessarily appropriate. And that's where our boundaries have been drawn, is that, you know, a lot of these kids that are being raised in this age of social media and sharing. And that was something that Lucy and I talked about really early on, is that this is our family story, and very much acknowledge that information sharing is the gateway to so much empowerment, especially within the queer community. But how might couples or solo parents kind of discern how to go about that process, who to let in, who to tell, and, you know, how to deal with family that might not necessarily get it. You know, when we told our parents, we sat them down and we were talking about them, and they've always been incredibly supportive. But, you know, language got mixed up and they were like, oh, the dad. And we're like, not the dad, the donor, you know, needing to have these conversations and just kind of set those boundaries in place with the people that are in our closest circle. Do you have any advice for anyone there?
It's actually a really complex one, because I think we were talking before we started this about language and how important it is, but I also don't know that there is clear language on the different ways that we create families. So we'll hear language around mum and dad and siblings, brothers and sisters. And for some families, that's not appropriate, depending on the situation. So I know after I gave birth, there were people referring to the surrogacy baby that I gave birth to as my daughter. And I found it quite jarring, because I was like, well, yes, technically, but also no. And she's got two dads. And what do I do with this? Because I feel like in one sense, yes, it's true, but also no, it's not. And how do I find the way with that? And we also talk about things like, am I her birth mother? I don't like the word mum, because I'm a mum for two little boys. This is not my child. She has two dads. And also I think they found it quite jarring when people would say, where's the mum? But as she gets older, she's finding her own language around this. And so she referred to my kids. She said the other day, these are my brothers. And I don't think she's too young to really understand the genetic side of it. But I was kind of delighted. I was like, this is actually good. She's finding her way with this. And if she comes out at 15 and says, yes, that's how I'm referring to them, that's great. But in the meantime, being very careful with friends and extended family around what language we're using. I'm not her mum. And half siblings I also find quite jarring, but yes, genetically they are half siblings. So I talk to clients a lot about this when they'll ask, can we call our donor uncle or dad? And does that change the kind of legal language around it? And technically you could call them whatever, but you do need to be very careful about if you're referring to somebody as dad, that might be appropriate in your family, but still being very clear about does he now get parenting rights and responsibilities in that? And maybe calling him uncle is a better idea. But again, it's, everybody's different. And some people will also refer to the children that share genetics as dibblings, which is like donor siblings, which is cute. But I also kind of went, I don't know that we'll do that. We're just referring to the kids by their names because that's what they are. I guess it is really important for the parents, and that if they've got a donor or a surrogate involved, to have that conversation, but see it as a fluid conversation, because there's probably not an end point. There was a point when I really hated the word surrogate because I felt like that's what I did rather than who I am. And I didn't like the hospital referring to me as mummy or tummy mummy or mother, because that also wasn't right. And these days I'm just Auntie Sarah. That's the right fit for me, because that is exactly who I am. But it also, it doesn't describe that I also gave birth to her or that I shared genetics with her. But when it comes to extended family, I think, being really clear that if you've got names or words that you've picked out together, that you ask other people to use those words and not use other words, because I think that can be confusing for the child if they're like, why did that person refer to that person as my dad? My mum told me that that's not true. His name is something else. And also being open to the child eventually making a decision for themselves, because they will, which is lovely. But being open about what that might look like. And if there's a word that jars for other people, then supporting the child to get to the point where they pick the words that are right for them.
Absolutely. That's really helpful advice. That's something that we're, increasingly more aware of. And I think something to touch on is also these are very weighty things to be thinking about when we're just trying to make a baby.
Right.
Sometimes it's just wait, hang on. I'm thinking about how I'm going to tell my 5-year-old or this, that, the other, or what her cousins say, and often it can just feel like, my God, on top of a toddler screaming, the laundry, everything that comes with being a parent, having all of this stacked on top of it, and these hypothetical conversations for our future, it can feel incredibly a bit overwhelming. I feel it often. Like sometimes I'll just be going about our day, you know, where to us we're just our normal little family, and then I'll think like, oh my God, what if I have this conversation with Mila when she's 15, and how is that going to go? And you know, you just sometimes it can be an incredibly emotionally charged thing. So I really want to acknowledge that. And that's where I suppose the support from our extended community, family, friends, medical system, colleagues really, really needs to step up, because with you supporting us and using appropriate language or not asking intrusive questions about whose eye color does she have, because often these are really, really emotionally charged decisions that we've been thinking about for years. You know, something that same-sex parents can't have is they both can't have a genetic link to the one child. And that can be really hard to navigate as parents. You know, so much of the silence that's filled in kind of talking about kids is, oh, who does she look like? Whose nose does she have, or whatnot? And there's always going to be one parent that might be finding it really hard to navigate those conversations. So I suppose
and
that's
I think
where
I do see that as well. And I think particularly when I talk to same-sex dads that are going to do surrogacy, I'll have to ask them questions about, you know, who's providing the eggs and the sperm. And I think they kind of gloss over the fact that one of them will not be the genetic father of the child. And I encourage them to do some counselling about that. Even if you think, no, it's fine, I'm okay with my partner being the genetic dad, that's great. But you may actually find that you've got some big feelings about it when your child doesn't look like you. And it's okay to feel that. I guess expressing that in a safe place and accessing support from other people, perhaps other parents that also don't share genetics with their children, and from a counsellor is a really good idea, because potentially you're putting that on the child, or you're kind of projecting that sort of, am I actually as legitimate as my partner who shares genetics? And maybe they, you know, the 3-year-old hates me today because I'm not the genetic parent. That sort of stuff, it's totally normal, unfortunately, sadly. But also I think about the fact that I know that my second son comes from me and comes from my partner, because there's no other option there. We know where this child came from. And yet for most of his childhood, he looks like one side of the family and not the other. And there's never been a question over where he comes from, but people will comment on how much he looks like one side of the family. And I know that same-sex families also have those conversations, but it's kind of got that loaded, oh, we know where they don't come from. And actually in my family, we've never had to think about it because we know where he came from, but he still only looks like one side. So recognising that though people will say, oh, they look like this parent, or who's the real mum, all that sort of crap, but being really strong in yourselves that this is a legitimate family that you've created with love, and holding strong in that, because the child actually deserves to know that that story was a positive story, but also that there's nothing wrong about them, because chances are by the time they get to school, there will be other kids that are also from, you know, 2 mum or 2 dad families, or divorced families, or single mums, or all those different ways of family. Yeah,
totally. I think that something that was really important to us early on, and I'm kind of backtracking a little bit further here, but thinking about the child's experience, and something that Lucy and I touched on was like, we really want Mila, or our first child, whoever they were going to be, to have siblings so they can share this process with someone. And, you know, obviously in same-sex couples, there is the opportunity, if both parties are physically able and willing, to have one egg, you know, one person's sperm, and vice versa. Something that was incredibly important to us was when we were choosing our donor, making sure that that donor was on board for us having multiple children after the fact. So I know there are lots of laws and limitations in place as to how many children a donor can, I suppose, bring into the world. That sounds like the wrong phrase, because it's not them bringing them into the world, but there are a certain number of families that donors can donate to. What advice do you have to shed on that, Sarah? Because future family planning, I suppose, is something to consider when you're choosing a donor, because if you're choosing someone and they're like, oh wait, multiple kids, like how many? Like if you're hoping to extend your family or grow your family in the future, having these conversations with your partner, or internally if you're solo parenting, and making sure that if it's important to you that your donor conceived children have a genetic link down the track, so they're not having multiple relationships with multiple people. For us, it was really important that our children have the same donor.
And actually, before I go on to that, I was going to mention that a lot of my clients will do egg sharing or reciprocal IVF, where one partner provides the eggs and the other partner carries the baby. That's totally legal. You can do that. I had somebody recently say to me, oh, I was told it was surrogacy. It's not. You got two women. My sister and her partner did it. My sister pumped out a lot of eggs, would you believe it? And her partner did the carrying. And it's actually kind of a really sweet thing where the partner that carried doesn't actually look like the child, but clearly they're all a family unit. It's quite lovely. So you can do that. There are family limits around donor conception. And so you can conceive with your own eggs or sperm, and it's really no problem. When you involve donors, then it becomes much more restricted. We have quite tight regulations around that, particularly in Victoria. But we have what we call family limits. And in Victoria, it's 10, which really just means 9 plus the donor's family, if he chooses to have a family. Whereas in other states, I think New South Wales and Queensland, the limit is 5. And donor conception laws are actually changing in other states. So it is a bit of a moving feast. We've had problems in Victoria where that family limit was applied to the woman rather than the family. So if one partner had already had a child using that donor as the donor, then that was like allocated 1. And then if that donor had done it for 8 other families, then they met their limit, which means the woman's partner could not use the same donor. They have changed the laws, but it's still a bit of a mess, to be honest. But I think, yeah, if you're using a friend or a family member as a donor, it's unlikely to be a problem because you know that donor is probably only donating to you. They might donate to another friend, for example. So the donor limit is less likely to impact. But having that conversation with them, like we would like to do this more than once, you obviously can't make them go ahead if you come back to them in 3 years and say, can we use your sperm again? But having that conversation that the intention is here that we have more than one child, are you on board with that? Because we'd like our child to share that genetic link. And I think most donors kind of see themselves as donating to the family and quite happy to continue it. When you use a clinic recruited donor, you need to ask questions around, well, what if my partner comes back in 3 years and we want to do it again with the same donor? What are the rules here and can we still use that same donor? Unfortunately, when I see people, it's often where that hasn't gone right, where there's been a problem and we've now used up the allocation of donor family limits and then, sorry, you can't use that. There's also some strict rules around using donor gametes, particularly where the donor has died. And also when they may change their mind. So it's worth asking. People will, dare I say it, they will tick boxes and sign forms at the clinic without thinking, what happens if I die? What happens if the donor dies? What happens if I change my mind? What happens if the donor changes their mind? You need to ask those questions and really understand what it means in those circumstances. We don't like talking about the bad things that can happen. Actually, lawyers do like talking about that. Sorry. But unfortunately, people come to me and go, we signed a form and we didn't even know what it meant. And you need to ask those questions so that you have a plan for what it looks like if your donor isn't an option for you in the future. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, we had a friend and they went through the IVF process and they went to get their second vial of sperm and it was not available. It was just heartbreaking for them because their second child couldn't have that genetic link. So I know as weighty as it can be, thinking about these things early on so that you can make sure it's involved in your family planning process. I suppose that's the reason that we're here, and information sharing. And I fully acknowledge that some, if not all of this conversation can be quite overwhelming. I know, I found it incredibly overwhelming and we're out the other side in many senses of this kind of road to conception family planning is concerned. So want to fully acknowledge that while we're trying to give you as much information as possible so you can go away and ask more questions or seek out more information, that it can be overwhelming. It can be really overwhelming because we're having to consider lots and lots here. Sarah, I wanted to kind of finish perhaps my last question before we hand it over to the group if there's any questions. If anyone has any questions, if you want to just pop them in the chat so Sarah and I can answer them before we sign off. But where do people go for support or resources? I know you mentioned Barter, which is an incredible resource for, people who are using donors to conceive and donor conceived children specifically. Any books that you can recommend? Any TV shows?
Just one moment. Anyone that knows me will know exactly which book I'm picking up. So this is my book. That's specifically about surrogacy, more than just a baby. So that's a guide for surrogacy for Australian intended parents and surrogates. VARTA is VARTA, VARTA, which is the Victorian Assisted Reproductive Treatment Authority. Their job is to regulate donor conception in Victoria. So they're a really great resource. They have fact sheets, they've got little YouTube videos to talk specifically about donor conception. And while it's Victorian based, those resources are available to anybody. I think probably my website, which is sarahjefford.com, I would say has the most amount of resources. There's a lot of articles.
Does.
Oh, good.
I wish we found Sarah when we were like, I found Sarah like 2 years too late. Like, what is going on here?
So lots of articles there about surrogacy and donor conception, about the legal process, about the things to consider. I've got like a blog post, which is just about, it's a list of conversation starters for your donor arrangement. And then there's another list for surrogacy. What are the things that we're going to talk about together and with our donor, that sort of stuff. And that's been collated over the years. There's also the surrogacy podcast if you're down that route. And actually the surrogacy podcast, it has 100 episodes. Some of them are specifically around home inseminations. There is one that we'd talk about. I think the word wank gets used in there somewhere. And there's also some about donor. I've spoken to donors and donor conceived person and somebody from VARTA. So you can actually pick out the sort of the episodes that might apply to you. I would say one of the other best resources I think I would be looking at might be Facebook groups like surrogacy ones, but also Rainbow Families. I know there's ones for donor conception and IVF. Being a bit picky about where you get your information from. We were talking before about being overwhelmed with the onslaught of information. Look out for the positive stories and maybe the families that reflect your family. I have told Lauren this story before, but we went with our intended parents and their daughter to Chill Out Festival here in Victoria, which is like the Rainbow Festival. And I just thought it was a lovely weekend that we'd all spend together. But I noticed that my intended parents liked that they were reflected in the community there. There's rainbow flags everywhere and there's 2 dad families and 2 mum families. And seeing themselves in the community, I think, is really important, not just for them, but also for their child. And I found that quite moving to see them do that. And I think, yeah, if you're feeling isolated or overwhelmed, reach out to your community, join Facebook groups for rainbow families. I know there's a gay intended dads group. I'm not allowed to be in it, which is very upsetting. But I've heard it's a great group. And yeah, build those communities with other people. My intended dads probably get the most amount of support from other 2 dad families, and I think that's great.
It's really important to seek out community, and it's part of the reason that I share so openly online because, while sometimes I'm like, well, should I be sharing my daughter online? I fully acknowledge that our family, to be represented and seen as a same-sex family means so much. I certainly wish I had a family like mine to look to when I was younger, or not knowing if, creating a family was going to be possible for me authentically. So please, as Sarah's mentioned, reach out to her. She's got so many incredible resources, both through her website, her blog posts, and her podcast. And, if you ever want to chat to someone who's gone through it, my email and my DMs are always open. I mean it 100% when we were going through it. Lucy perhaps knew one friend who went through it the way that we'd chosen to go through it with that specific arrangement. So because there are so many unique ways to go about it, sometimes if you can find someone to speak to that, has gone through exactly what you're going through, it just makes you feel a little bit less alone and like you've got someone in your corner or someone to ask questions to. So beyond today's call, if you have any questions for either of us, please don't hesitate to reach out.
I was going to say, if we've got a few minutes here, I see there's a few questions in the chat.
Oh, can you? I can't see any.
You can't see any?
No.
I'll enlighten you. There is a question from somebody, and actually I think there's maybe a couple of questions that might be similar. Can we speak about the barriers that trans people face when accessing fertility treatment? Oh, I'd really like to say there are none, but we know that's not true. I think that I'm still hearing sometimes that there's a lot of gendered language, cis hetero presumptions at IVF clinics. So you may need to be ready to advocate for yourself to make sure that they've marked down what your pronouns are and that they know who they're talking to on the phone. We were talking before, Lauren, about expecting that if you've got a feminine voice, that therefore you must have a male partner, that sort of thing. Like you're probably going to face that all the time. As a cis hetero surrogate, I found that if I stood in a queue with the gay man that I was having a baby for, people would assume it was my next of kin and that it was my husband, and we'd have to kind of challenge that. So I expect it's frustrating, and perhaps in that circumstance, if you're worried about, you know, being triggered or needing support, then taking somebody with you, and being really clear about what that language is on their file so that they know who they're talking to before you get there. The treatment itself, though, I would expect should be the same. One of the people that I know has talked about this is Jackie Jacks Brown. So perhaps look them up on, I know they're on Facebook, but they talk about disability queer activism, and I think they also did IVF with their partner. So their experience, I know that was meant to inform IVF clinics on how to improve their accessibility and their support for the queer community. One of the other questions we've got is, where is the best place to find state-specific laws around donor gametes, reciprocal IVF and surrogacy for ART? Probably my website. You could, I mean, if you're not in the know, you're not sure what you're looking for. So if you Googled, for example, surrogacy law, Queensland, you will find what you're looking for. But if you go, can you hear my dog barking in the background? Sorry, everyone. Yeah, if you have a look on my website, I've got a specific section that's just for the laws around surrogacy. Donor conception laws, they're actually a bit of a funny kettle of fish because some of the states don't have really clear laws. So we go by the ethical guidelines for the clinics. That's another whole thing that we look at. We call them, I think it's the National Health and Medical Research Guidelines or something. But if you email me, I can find them for you and send them. And what are the requirements for singles and couples assigned female at birth to access Medicare rebates? Does this differ in each state? It's a really good question. So we have a bit of an issue with Medicare, excuse me, whereby you can access a Medicare rebate when you do IVF as a person assigned female at birth if you were doing the IVF for yourself and if you still have a uterus. It becomes a bit trickier if you don't have a uterus, or if you can't use your uterus and they know it's for surrogacy. As soon as you mention the word surrogacy, then the rebates become less available, and it does then depend on the clinic, but the law actually says the same. And it's a bit of a complex reason why that is, which I won't go into. But if you are a cisgendered woman with a uterus, you can probably get a rebate. If you don't have a uterus, or you're, well, essentially, yes, no uterus, no rebate is what I've been saying. We have been pushing for Parliament to change that, and they're talking about changing it, but it hasn't actually happened yet. So it's, you know, something to watch out for. Yeah. Can you share any implications for people who have started the journey to having a baby on their own, but then their relationship status has changed throughout the process? And yes, I think this was a question that might have been put forward before. That's a really good question. It's a bit complex, so it will be different for everyone, but I would suggest you need to get legal advice. One of the issues we have, and it differs state to state, is that if you conceive a child, regardless of where the eggs and the sperm come from, if you conceive a child at the time of being in a relationship and that person consented to going ahead and making a baby together, you're now both the parents of that child until the court says otherwise. So it's a bit complex. If you've decided you're going to have a baby together, you fall pregnant, and then the relationship ends, well, now you're stuck together in some way for life because you're both the parents. I have seen some difficulties where, for example, people have created embryos as a couple, but they might have used, say, donor sperm, and then the relationship breaks up and the person who had the eggs involved has gone off to do embryo transfer. And legally, there's some issues there where actually the ex-partner potentially could still be seen as a parent of that child. So number one would be get legal advice. And number two is we need to work out what we're communicating to the clinic about those embryos or the IVF treatment, or when are we conceiving, that sort of thing. If you're already pregnant and there's a separation, then yes, get legal advice and we work out what to do from there. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that might be all the questions for now, unless somebody wants to. We've got a couple more minutes if anybody wants to add anything else. And of course, if you wanted to, if there was a question bubbles away tonight in the middle of the night, that's what I do. I wake up at 2 a.m. and think things over. Feel free to email me. You can just look up sarahjefford.com, or you can email hello@sarahjefford.com, and I'll get back to you with some resources and answers if you need them.
Absolutely. And that goes for me too. If anyone, has any questions come through, or they just want to chat about the process, I am always an ear willing to listen and shed any advice or support that I can, because as I mentioned earlier, I truly wished resources like this existed when we were in 2020 lockdown trying to start a family.
Absolutely.
And on forums, and we touched on this earlier, Sarah, it was like it's something I didn't consider when we opted to seek out the support of a fertility clinic, is that I would be lumped in with all the hetero people that had been struggling to conceive for years, and then all of a sudden I had to like remind myself that I wasn't that person. It was a bizarre time.
And we talked before about what's this, social infertility. What is that, and why do we use that word? In surrogacy, we refer to it as being you must have a medical or a social need for surrogacy. What is a social need? You chose not to have a baby yourself.
Yeah, I told Sarah when we sat down at the clinic, we were talking about the Medicare rebates and what would be available to us, and often something that same-sex female couples will hear when they go to the clinic to employ the support of fertility specialists is you need to go through sometimes 2 rounds of IUI first before then going to IVF to be considered medically infertile. Like, oh, you tried twice and sorry, no luck. But, being socially infertile, which is just such an antiquated title to be called, as though it's your choice. It's a bizarre thing, but yeah, social infertility doesn't equal Medicare rebate straight away. But if you can prove that you've tried a couple times, then you're eligible for that rebated IVF cycle with Medicare. So I'm sure there are lots of questions that might pop to mind afterwards, or we become experts by going through the process, sadly.
Yes, absolutely. I do say to my clients, you end up with a bit of a PhD in researching donor conception or surrogacy. And I guess it's that you're being armed with knowledge. Take your time. I appreciate it feels overwhelming. Don't feel like it's a rush. Hopefully it's not a rush, because these things, if you do them over time and you take the time to research and think about what's important to you, then the outcome is going to be much more positive. Yeah,
absolutely. And above all, it's something to celebrate and something to be incredibly excited about. We have a long way to go in terms of the law and language at large supporting unique family structures, but the law has come a long way whereby, we're a 2-mum family that exists and our family is acknowledged by law, the minute that our daughter was born, which is, I just feel so grateful for, because it wasn't something that was available to members of our community 10, 20, 30 years ago. So there is a large amount of privilege, even though we're having incredibly weighty discussions. And more than anything, your journey and your child's journey of coming to be is just one of complete and utter love, because this road might be long and windy, but to me, it just makes you a better parent. You can truly, you've been through so much with your partner or on your own, if this is where you're landing. I always say to be queer is to know yourself, which is just the greatest privilege. And so to go through this and create a family, you're a super parent already before the child even exists, truly.
And what a gift you've got for the child that you've gone through all of this before. Like I said, a recovering divorce lawyer. So many people didn't have that gift or that opportunity to really think through what their family looked like before they were actually divorcing somebody that maybe they didn't like in the first place. You're doing all I hear you on why are we having to do the counselling, but actually see it as an investment in your relationship with each other and with the child.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you as always. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks so much to the Memo for hosting conversations like this in the first place. It's incredibly important for the queer community. And thanks everyone who showed up today.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for having me, Lauren.
Bye. Thanks everyone.